Hi, I'm George Flanagan, your instructor for Christian ethics. If you notice on your syllabus, after this week, I've asked you to write a paper about your own personal moral development. And as you're thinking about that and what to write, I thought it would be good to introduce you to Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. I have to say first that not everybody agrees that he did very good research, but I find it a good explication of moral development. I think it works in terms of allowing us to understand the progression that we go through as human beings. So I'm going to give it to you in brief form here. Know also that you can look up additional material on just about on many sites if you just Google them. The Wikipedia site is very good, and there's one called Simply Psychology. You can find more material if you're intrigued about the topic. But here's how Kohlberg begins. He gives a moral case. He says in Europe, a woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $400 for the radium and he charged $4,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money and tried every legal means, but he could only get together about $2,000, half of what it would cost to get the drug. So he went to the druggist and he sat and he talked to him and he said, "Look, my wife is sick. She's dying. Would you sell this drug to me cheaper, or could you at least let me pay you over time or pay you later?" And the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So, having tried every legal means, Heinz gets desperate and he considers breaking into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. And that leaves the question then for us to answer. Should Heinz break into the store to steal the drug for his wife? Now, I want you to take a moment to consider the pros and cons. Why should he or why shouldn't he? Try to figure out where you are on the issue right now. And as we talk about it a little more, think about if you shift or if you become more ambivalent about what Heinz ought to do. Ambivalence would not be an unusual response, but let's see what it says about us in terms of our moral reasoning. Now, one thing I want to say as we go into this is to understand that ethics is precisely a process of reasoning. It's not about identifying some certain laws or rules that we always follow, but it involves a reasoning process of taking those principles and rules that are important to us and applying them to a particular situation. So that's what we're doing here. As we look at the situation, think about the rules and the principles and the theories that inform you that you've developed through your life. There are some questions that might help you with this. I borrowed these from an article in a larger book that I'm going to share with you at another time. But it says in the development of your own moral sense, who were your principal teachers? Who did you turn to? Or maybe not on purpose, but who was always there? Your mom, your grandmother, your older brother or sister, your teachers, your ministers. Who else in your world was a teacher of yours as you developed morally? And then once you identify that, give examples of right and wrong actions that you learned from the example of these moral mentors, not just what they said to you, but how they lived their lives, what their integrity looked like, and what kind of moral statement it made to you as you decided and formed your moral self. Give examples of rules that you were taught for knowing the difference between right and wrong. That's essentially what morality is discerning the difference between right and wrong in any given situation. But as we grow up especially, those around us who are important to us give us certain rules to make it easier for us, they think, to make those kinds of decisions about right or wrong. Hopefully those rules will serve us through childhood, maybe into adolescence. But as it says in number 4, as time passes, you are going to make some adjustments to those rules that you were taught. And so this is where you start to try to be aware of how you have changed from that rule set that you started with as a child or an early adolescent and have become a mature adult. How have rules changed? What new ones have you taken on? What old ones have you cast off? And so number 5 is just a question of reflection. Why is it that you do not lie, cheat, or steal? As a child, you probably would have said, well, it's because my mother told me not to lie, cheat, or steal. But now that you're an adult, a mature adult, what's your reason? Is it still just because your mother told you not to? Or have you come to learn on your own why those actions are not moral actions that you want to embrace as part of your own moral character? Well, that's what happens when we start to talk about our own moral development. When you read the directions for the paper that I've asked you to write, you'll see how these questions will be useful to you as well. Well, the term morality, there's a lot of different definitions you can get. In fact, you'll hear me use different ones as we get into different topics, but we can start with this one, that it refers to a code of conduct that may be put forward by a society. For example, as ministers, we have a code of ministerial conduct that we have obligated ourselves to as commissioned or ordained ministers. When I was a chaplain, we had a code of ethics from the Association of Professional Chaplains that gave boundaries or guidelines about how we were to conduct ourselves in relationship to our patients. So it's that kind of a code that somebody else sets up. You might even consider the Ten Commandments a sort of code, although it's very general in its structure. It's a code that has been set up and put forward, and one that you may select to be your own code. That's our hope for most people who are Judeo-Christian faith people, but not everybody agrees with all of that. But that's the ideal. That's how those kinds of codes exist. We could even go back older and look at the Code of Hammurabi and how it was a very early example of how laws were put together, codes were put together for right moral behavior, all of which allowing us to live together in the same world, trusting that we aren't going to do each other in. Well, the second thing that we can mean by morality is just a general code of conduct, maybe one that you've designed for yourself. It has specific conditions, but it's something that we think would be put forward by all rational persons, as it says here in this Stanford definition. A little later, I'm going to introduce you to the theory of a man named Bernard Gert, an American philosopher who wrote what he called the moral rules theory. And the moral rules theory relates very much to the second definition of morality. It's about the rules that we have and the fact that we have put them together over years to allow us to live together in community. Well, let's look at KOHLBERG'S theory briefly. And as I say, this is going to be a very brief overview, so if you want to read more, you can find plenty on the internet. KOHLBERG said all of us have the opportunity to move through 3 levels of morality during our lifetime. And essentially it means early childhood, then on to adolescence and early adulthood, and then on to middle and later adulthood. But he has very creative titles for them, as you can see here on the slide. Well, we look at the first level, pre-conventional morality, and the very basic stage 1, is obedience and punishment. As children, we make our choices about what to do or not to do based on our sense of obeying an authority and our wanting to avoid punishment. And that works pretty well while we're children. If that's still what you go by as you're an adult, then you're having a lot of trouble probably surviving in this world. A lot of people who commit crime are ones who are still living by the rule, I don't want to get punished, but they go to this stage 2 that says, but I can make a deal with reality here. I can get what I want and make a trade-off of some sort so I will not end up getting punished. We essentially convince ourselves that there is no penalty by violating any kind of moral principles or rules. And that's what exchange means here for KOHLBERG. He writes that it accounts for individual points of view, and we judge actions based on how they serve our individual needs. The best course of action for Heinz might be the choice that best served Heinz's needs. And reciprocity is possible at this point in moral development, but only if it serves our own interests. So you begin making more choices in stage 2, but it's an ethical egoism. It's all about our own needs and doing what we believe is good for us. And once again, we know many adults who never get any further than this in their moral development. Or they may get further some, but other times, under certain forms of stress, they regress to one of these stages in how they make their moral decision. Level 2, as we grow older, is a little more sophisticated and it'll look very familiar to you. And if you have adolescents or if you're pastoring in a church, it says we go along to get along. We want good personal relationships, so we're not going to break any of the rules that would get us out of those relationships. If we're part of a community of people of some sort, be it a family or a congregation or a town or a school, we tend to go along with what everybody has agreed is the moral norm for that community. That way we can have good personal relationships. We don't think critically about the choices that we make on the basis of any higher level of reasoning or thinking. We just do it because it feels good to have people like us, to have a group of people to belong to, and the best way to do that is not to disagree with one another. We go along, even as basically as when your mom said, if everybody went to jump off a cliff, would you want to jump off the cliff too? That's a rather rudimentary way of putting it, but it's essentially the same principle. As we grow older, though, and hopefully go through our education, we learn that certain sets of rules or principles or laws are necessary to maintain what we call social order. It is so we literally can feel comfortable living in a community of people, trusting that we aren't going to get damaged or hurt or have our goods stolen by somebody else. There are always those who will violate. But generally, if everyone follows the rules, we have a good social order and it makes it possible for us to get on with life. In the early stages of humankind, when life was very primitive, much of life was spent trying to defend oneself. If you're familiar with Maslow's theory, Maslow says at the very bottom level of development, we're just thinking about surviving, getting food and water, clothing and shelter, and protecting ourselves from anyone else who wants to come hit us over the head and steal our food and water. So a lot of people will stop right here and just make most of their moral decisions based on the need to maintain the social order. They will go the speed limit. They won't shoot their neighbors. They won't steal their neighbor's lawnmower. They'll just know that these are things that we have to do so that we can all get along. And sometimes, living at this stage, they will even regress some to an earlier stage. But if we're well off, we can move to a higher level of moral reasoning, and that's called post-conventional morality. In post-conventional morality, the first level, number 5, is social contract and individual rights. And Kohlberg would explain it like this. Let me grab a sheet of paper here. Kohlberg would say simply that in social contract or individual rights, we become aware, and even if we're children, we become aware that rules and laws might exist for the good of the greatest number. But there are times when the rules will work against the interests of particular individuals. And so we become aware that we all have rights that allow us to take exception to what is the normal way of getting along and going along. And we begin to value the necessity of protecting those rights for individual thinking and individual acting in different ways. You look at Heinz's dilemma, and the issues are not always clear-cut. The protection of life may be more important than breaking the law against stealing. You try to make a decision about what's going to be most important for the people that you care about and you want to protect. Now we get to the highest level, stage 6. Kohlberg would say really not very many of us will get to that stage, but we aspire to it because it's about human rights and justice. It's about equality. And a stage 6 person will strive to function and to protect these principles, to protect people so that they may be able to live by these principles, and the rest of society is going to pay consequences of disapproval or imprisonment if they go against it. But it's about understanding the larger sense of justice and fair play and human dignity and the sanctity of life that instructs us on how we regard other people and how we make moral decisions with regard to other persons. All of these decisions that are moral decisions are about our relationships with God, with creation, and with other human beings. Those are the decisions that we make, how we're going to act in those kinds of relationships. Well, the Heinz Dilemma was published in 1981, and you can read more about that, as I say, as you go online. But think through these and see if this gets you thinking just a little bit about how you would come to understand your own moral development. One last word about this process that Kohlberg was talking about. In his research, he was working with children. He had a group of 8-year-old boys, and he interviewed all of them and gave them a set of 10 different cases and asked them how they would respond. And on the basis of his interviews with these children, talking to them about their decisions, he began to identify how they were understanding life from different levels of moral development. You might be interested in reading more about that as well. But thanks for listening so far, and good luck with that paper. If you need for help with the paper, just give me a text, and I'll be glad to help you out.